I'm going to get us started. Welcome to this panel on housing. Big thanks to Statehouse Futures for having us. I'm super excited to be in conversation with two leaders on the fight for social housing across the country. So just before we get started, I'll allow these two a second to introduce themselves. I want to introduce myself. My name is Tara Raghuveer. I'm a tenant organizer, and I'm the director of KC Tenants, an organization led by poor and working class tenants in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm also the director of the Campaign for a National Homes Guarantee based at People's Action. This campaign was really my introduction to social housing. The Homes Guarantee is a campaign with a very simple premise. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We can and we must guarantee that everyone has a home. This is a simple premise, but one that is obviously complicated. And it's complicated by what I like to call a conspiracy of the profiteers, right? Those who benefit from the status quo in which a tenant earning minimum wage can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any American county. Those who benefit from this status quo have created a world that convinces us that housing cannot be delivered any other way but through the private market. Right? These people convince us, and their companies, their corporations, the laws that defend them convince us that we can't have it another way. But tenants across the country know that another way is possible. We've dreamed of it. We've written policy around it. We've elected leaders to support it. We're organizing for it every day. And a critical component of this better world that we've dreamed of is social housing. So the quick and dirty definition of social housing that I'll share before I ask our guests to share theirs is it's housing that's off the private market and it's not available for speculation. It's not an investment. It's not a commodity. It's a guaranteed public good or human right that people just get to have. So I want to start by asking our guests, Saoirse and Vaughn Stewart, who's a delegate in Maryland, to introduce themselves. And I also want to ask you, in addition to sharing what social housing is and how you relate to social housing in your work, why it matters to you, right? Because both of you, I know through your work on this issue day in and day out, I want to know on a personal level why this stuff matters to you. Saoirse, you want to start?
So hi everyone. My name is Saoirse Gowan. I am a policy expert on issues surrounding housing, social housing, tenants' rights, other housing justice issues. I have experience working in the Irish Parliament or Dáil Éireann around issues of housing justice. I also wrote the paper Social Housing in the United States for the People's Policy Project back in 2018. I have worked on state and federal legislation around the issue of social housing, including with Delegate Stewart, who's on this call. And I also am, like Tara, an organizer. I am on the steering committee of Metro DC DSA, which is a 3,000 member organization that fights for economic, social, and racial justice in the DC metro area. And so I'm I sort of have two hats. I both organize for this stuff and I also know a lot about it. Social housing is really important to me because I want to see a world without homelessness, housing cost overburden, substandard housing, and the sort of rapacious profiteering that we see from the private sector landlords and the underfunding of the public sector in housing and disinvestment that we see towards public housing tenants. I think that social housing, for me, is, like Tara says, it's a vision of housing that is provided off the private market permanently, provided as a social good, not as an investment opportunity, and also is like a horizon that we can fight towards as tenants for the kind of housing that we need. So the social housing should be permanently affordable to everyone, provided it's a right. It also should be high quality, adjacent to transit and amenities, and racially and environmentally just.
Thanks, Saoirse. How about you, Delegate Stewart? What is social housing to you, and why did you come to care so much about this?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's awesome to be here. I'm Delegate Von Stewart. I'm a state legislator in Maryland. I serve in Maryland's State House, which is what we call the House of Delegates. I was elected in 2018, so I've only been in office since 2019. And my personal story actually goes back to when I first moved to Maryland several years ago. One of the first kind of political, if you will, acts that I did is I tried to organize a tenants association in my own building in Silver Spring, Maryland. And we did all the right things. We actually got buy-in from some of the local elected officials. One of them, actually, Jamie Raskin, ended up being kind of a bit of a national celebrity. But back when he was a state senator, we had him. We had a number of other elected officials come to our big first meeting of the tenants association. We, talked to organizers. We flyered the neighborhood. We were very excited for the launch. And the landlord was standing in the doorway of the meeting space, threatening to call the cops if we walked one step further and tried to get into the meeting room. So we, of course, did so. We sort of pushed the landlord aside, and she indeed called the cops on us. And so our first meeting was derailed because we had to go downstairs on the ground level and had to have a conversation with the police department about why we shouldn't be arrested for trying to have a tenants association meeting. And that experience really kind of launched my political involvement and kind of my career in politics here in Maryland, because I got to know people. I continued to fight. We ultimately did not only start a tenants association in the building, but we actually passed a law in the county to say that landlords are required to offer any meeting space for free to tenants once a month for the purpose of tenants associations and tenant organizing. So that kind of kicked off for me, my career and my interest in housing in general. And then when I ran for office, and I especially keyed in on working class, and I was running, as a Democratic Socialist with the endorsement of the Metro DC DSA. And so I was concentrating, especially in trying to juice turnout from communities of color, from working class neighborhoods. And when you go and you canvass and you knock on these folks' doors, I would say, by and large, at least the plurality issue that is most important to them is housing stability. It's either mold or vermin in terms of the quality of their housing. It's the fact that the rising housing costs are consuming more and more of their paycheck, and they fear eviction. They fear their lease not being renewed. They fear basic things like their kids having to switch schools for the 5th time in a couple of years. Not having housing stability means you can't really fully integrate into a community and be part of a community. And I think that's why this conversation is so important. So when I got elected, I knew I wanted to do something on housing. I kind of looked around. I was trying to find a big idea that I could grasp onto that has worked at least somewhere else in the world to make housing permanently affordable and make housing a human right like it should be. And I actually happened upon Saoirse's paper on social housing policy, written in 2018, perfectly timed for me being sworn in early 2019. I reached out to Saoirse. I actually met her at a local DSA meeting. We had coffee, and we put together the first iteration of the social housing bill that I introduced in 2019. And since then, we've kept our foot on the gas. We have not gotten it over the finish line yet. We are getting closer and closer. This is tough sledding, and we can certainly get into kind of lessons that I've learned. But my definition of social housing is pretty simple. It's a public option for housing. I think that's something that everyone can wrap their heads around. I think that, Tara's actually absolutely right that the private market has failed to meet the needs of renters in Maryland and across the country. And I think the bill that I put in and the idea of social housing broadly is meant to close a massive housing gap and to finance thousands or millions of publicly owned, deeply affordable homes that are built sustainably and with unionized labor. And it's based on, obviously, my bill is based on what I consider to be a wildly successful model in Vienna. And the goal is to create homes that are not only beautifully designed, but also near transit, that are accessible to those with disabilities and available to folks across the income spectrum. So that's my definition. And again, happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Delegate Stewart. For anyone who's just joining us, we are talking about social housing. We're asking each of the panelists to share what social housing means to them and why they care about it. And I'm very happy that we get to welcome Assemblymember Alex Lee from California, another champion across the country for social housing. Alex, it's so nice to meet you. Could you tell us what social housing means to you and why you're working so hard to introduce social housing to the state of California?
Well, absolutely. I'm really honored to join this great panel, and I actually got early in the year to meet Delegate Stewart too, and we traded some notes about it. But I represent the 25th Assembly District in California of 500,000 people in the South and East Bay Area in California. If you know anything about the Bay Area in California, it is ground zero for affordability across the state. So obviously the concern of housing affordability is very real amongst people in the Bay Area, people in my district. And something that I have figured out from experience and from policy work is that obviously the private market is not meeting the needs we have to meet. They will keep producing market rate housing that will cater to a certain audience. And then we obviously have some nonprofit housing that's very slowly eking away at the very margins of it, right? What is really missing is a lot of housing abundantly for everyone. So just like Delegate Stewart, I actually happened upon your paper as well. I forgot who sent it to me. Someone actually who was originally, I think, from the DC metro area and also part of DSA, and they had moved over here, and they had sent to me a long time ago. So I had that idea in the back of my mind for a long time. And it was actually something I campaigned about. To me, it's very simple. How we actually deliver affordable housing for everyone is if the public gets to decide. If we publicly develop, publicly own, and publicly maintain housing, just like they do in a lot of other places in the world, we can actually deliver housing instead of relying on the market. And we are having our social housing bill, Assembly Bill 387, moving along the process right now. It will hopefully have its first hearing in January, but we are having a very robust discussion and dialogue right now and drafting the bill and making sure that we can actually deliver sustainable, affordable housing that's abundantly available for everyone, and obviously union produced as well. In fact, I was actually really good timing is today I went to one of our modular housing production factories that's actually very heavily partnered with our union, with union partnership, and actually seeing how it can innovate and produce even more housing units as much as possible. So we are trying to really innovate those things. So to me, it's really important to be able to have that public delivery. I always liken it to folks who are not familiar with the concept of, imagine if we produce roads the way we produce housing, or we contract with private entities and they just figure out where they would like to build it for profit, right? We would have a nightmare of a transportation system, as worse as already is. It would be even worse, and that would not be good, right? We produce transportation as a public resource, as public infrastructure for a reason. We can do it with housing the same way.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm hearing a lot of alignment, right? The private market is failing. I'm seeing Arturo in the comments say community over commodity. I think that's awesome. And hopefully there's a lot of other people who are tuning in today who are already on the same page, or maybe will be convinced by some of the arguments you've just made and pursue some of the amazing policy steps that Delegate Stewart and Assemblymember Lee have taken. So I want to actually start again with the two of you, since you've already introduced policy at the state level in Maryland and in California. I'm curious, especially as someone who's worked on social housing concepts for the federal level and for the municipal level, why you think the state level is actually an interesting battleground to try to fight for and win social housing, and what, if any, are the unique opportunities or challenges that are available to you at the state level as you pursue these policies. Delegate Stewart, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I think the state level is the ideal level to push for this. I'm, of course, admittedly biased, but I think it's really for two reasons. I think one, especially in states where we have Democratic supermajorities like Maryland, where theoretically a supermajority of legislators, I know this is not purely reality, but theoretically a majority of legislators care about working people and care about making sure that everyone can have housing. That's certainly what they'll tell you. That's what you'll read on their campaign websites. And so, you know, in blue states, we have the majorities to actually get things done. We're not reliant on Joe Manchin and Kristen, Sinema growing a spine or coming back down to reality. We can just pass stuff. In Maryland, for example, in the Maryland House of Delegates, there are 141 members, and we have 99 Democrats. So we can afford to lose a lot of neoliberal Democrats and still have room to spare to pass something on social housing and a number of other progressive priorities. So first, we can actually do stuff on the state level. It's not gridlocked. It's not a mess like Congress. But number two, unlike a lot of local governments, we have resources. We have a lot more money at our disposal than most municipalities, whether they're sort of run as a municipality or a county. We've got a lot of money to throw around, and I think we can proactively work with counties. For example, my bill is set up in a way that basically counties bid to the state with projects. They submit proposals for how they want to run social housing projects, and then the state would sort of evaluate the proposals based on various criteria, select winners, and then dispense monies. But I think that's essentially what makes the state level so exciting is, number one, we do stuff, and number two, we have money.
That's awesome. Thanks, Delegate Stewart. I wish Missouri looked a little bit more like Maryland after hearing that pitch. But Assemblymember Lee, let's hear from you. What do you think is the opportunity and the challenge of trying to pursue social housing at the state level?
Well, precisely the same reasons as Delegate Stewart, right? We have, in California, we have a Democratic ultramajority and control of the entire state government unless the recall happens and we have a Republican governor for a little bit. That might be an oddity, though, but it's not a structural thing. But we do have money and we do have political willpower. It's very much possible to do so. California likes to pride itself as being the 5th largest economy in the world. If it was its own republic, in which case many times California tries to be that way, we could, we can do a lot. And I think leveraging the power of the state and leveraging the buying power, the ability to coordinate is unparalleled. Having a master developer at a California level where there's 40 million people is a game changer. And as we know from history, states are the incubators of change in a lot of ways that percolate up to the federal level. I mean, states were the ones that pioneered income tax that obviously make a lot of things possible. So I think it's really possible to do that at the state level. And I just think it's very possible. We definitely have less gridlock at the state level than the federal level, but we still have a lot of neoliberal shenanigans definitely that occur. But I think we can push through it if there's a coordinated effort across the country and across in California that push to say we need to decommodify housing and produce housing as infrastructure. And I think definitely even in this time with this federal administration where there's a strong emphasis on infrastructure, which is, as we know, a winning topic amongst all people of all ideological perspectives, we can actually get it done.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much money actually coming from the federal government down to states and cities at this point. An incredibly useful way to spend that money might be on structural changes like social housing that would actually meaningfully for the long term transform our housing market away from a market rather and towards housing delivered as a public good. So Saoirse, I want to bring you back in. Critics of social housing will say, we've done this in the US. Public housing was a failure. I would quickly interrupt them and say, no, the federal government failed public housing and public housing residents through decades of disinvestment and racist mythology that spun into the existing stigma that we have today. Nonetheless, what do you say to those detractors who say, we've already tried this, it's a failure? And in other words, I guess, how is social housing, as you propose it, maybe a different thing from what we know as public housing in the United States? You're on mute, by the way.
Well, I think that you already partially provided my answer here. So yeah, I'll start by saying that, public housing in the United States started and was throughout its history marked by, from the beginning, compromises, and then those compromises themselves being undermined over and over again, to the detriment of the tenants that live within it. It started as a segregated program and over decades of disinvestment ended up as a program that, while certainly providing stable housing to a lot of people and one that needs to be defended and fully funded permanently, it has always had the issue of being conceived by the government as a program only for the very poorest in society, and in many cases segmented market where public housing was provided to a predominantly people of color, lower income group, while far more money was provided in subsidized mortgages to upper middle and upper class white people. So I don't think that you can separate out the history of public housing from the history of private housing in the United States. I think that what social housing needs to do differently is that it needs to be conceived from the very beginning as a program that is designed to create racial and environmental justice from the very beginning, where we have people from different social backgrounds living in integrated communities that is permanently affordable to everyone, and where housing is of a high quality for everyone who lives in it. I think that the person who sweeps the streets should be living in the same building as doctors, lawyers, nurses, teachers, unemployed people, and people who are living on the streets right now. I think that like we need to have vision when we talk about social housing. And I think that the vision should be like universal, socially provided housing that is funded that is well funded, that is progressively funded, and that looks to models outside of just the history of what's happened in the United States, while also making sure that we don't leave behind anyone who's living in public housing right now, and that we have investments like the Green New Deal for public housing and other investments that are necessary to ensure that people are protected in the homes they're currently living in, that they aren't privatized and subjected to another round of disinvestment.
Thanks so much. Really, really instructive. I'm going to mute you again because I think there's some feedback on your line. But that was really instructive. Thank you so much for sharing that. And just to add a little bit on what you said, I think what we've started doing and talking about social housing in Kansas City, where we're trying to win the first municipal social housing in the country. Cross your fingers, say a prayer for us. I think we got this. We got a powerful base of tenants is going to make it happen. But what we've been saying here is that social housing also is going to look different in different types of places, right? It's going to look different in Maryland than it looks in California. It's definitely going to look different in Kansas City than it's going to look in DC. Right. And social housing, I think, is a term that can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't have to jog our memory to like the big project-based public housing of the 20th century. It can look different now, and we can dream of a different way forward. So I want to get back to our folks who are working at the state level on policy, Delegate Stewart and Assemblymember Lee. How do we win? Right? You're both in states where you have the potential to win this. You said you could even like not get a bunch of the neoliberal Democrats and still win this, right? So what is the pathway to victory? And specifically, what's the coalition you're building? What's the story you're telling? And what's the assignment that you're making to organizers to have your back and create the political space that you need to carry this over the finish line?
Sure, I can take a crack at that. So we've had the bill come forward 3 years. So in those 3 years or 3 straight sessions. So in those 3 sessions, we've learned a lot of lessons. Number one, I think the trickiest part that we keep struggling with is the financing structure. We started, Saoirse and I basically designed a millionaire's tax and a bond to fund this, and both received a lot of pushback. I think partially because the millionaire's tax was just really easy to understand and therefore really easy to attack. So then I tried to pivot to what if we used a real estate transaction tax, which sounds really boring, but it's basically like a McMansion tax. That found a little bit more, a little bit less opposition, a little bit more support. But we've been basically playing a whack-a-mole with every time we pose a new financing system, a new corporate entity that holds a lot of sway in our state capital comes forward and says, oh, no, you can't tax me to fund your social housing bill. So that's really the challenge we have is financing. In terms of the strategy to win, it's really about, I think, uniting the left and really dividing the capitalist class. I mean, dividing the opposition, dividing the corporate interests. And so, I think for those that are like broadly left of center, kind of like the broad tent of leftists, people have different views on housing. Some people care a lot about trying to relax zoning restrictions. Some people care most prominently about things like rent control and less about the construction of new units. And so one thing that we've had to do, and it's been painstaking, but it's been purposeful, is trying to unite all the factions together that care at least a little bit about housing justice and the idea of housing as a human right together behind our bill is the vehicle to do that. And we've done a pretty good job of that. We still, of course, have more organizing and coalition building to do. And then on the flip side, it's been trying to pick off a few of these members of kind of the corporate elite, the corporate community in Annapolis that holds a lot of power over a lot of my colleagues, and try to at least break a few of them down. Like, for example, the realtors or the builders who, depending on how the bill is structured, and if they squint, they could really see some of their self-interest promoted by the bill. So that's been sort of our, make sure that it's a boring financing structure, make sure we unite the left, make sure we divide the opponents. And then the last thing I think is just to make this seem not so utopian. We've tried to boil this down to something that has worked elsewhere, that is just a boring, simple way to do housing. It just makes sense from a dollars and cents perspective to do public housing on public land. You can do it cheaply. You can do cross-subsidization to keep the rents low. We try to make it sound really boring and really simple and a really tried and true way so that it cannot be painted as some sort of utopian pie in the sky broad brush. And so we've been trying to get support from kind of boring elected officials, not like really cool, socialist ones like me, but really boring, stodgy ones too, to help make the impression or help make the point that this is a ho-hum idea that just so happened will change a lot of people's lives.
I wish I got messaging tips from you before we made the KC Tenants proposal bright yellow, because it's definitely not boring. Assemblymember Lee, let me pull you in really quick. What's the coalition look like? How are you going to win in California?
Yeah, the coalition in California, it's very much similar, where we have to build a big grand coalition I call the housing space. So it's getting our labor advocates together, our builders, which are kind of the private space, right? Our housing advocates, our tenants' rights folks, everyone who is interested in it, and hopefully also bringing into, I don't like this phrase, but generally people who are more resistant to housing, generally the ideas of that. In California, I think the biggest roadblock we have right now is education. Social housing, as great as everyone on here we're talking about, is a very niche idea, even in California, where, the vast majority of people live in suburbs of some sort or consider themselves to live in the suburb. So we have to do a lot of educating, right? Past social housing is not just your idea of the projects or public housing from the past in America, and also what is this concept? So there's a lot of the educating aspect, and that's where kind of I diverge a little bit from Delegate Stewart. Is I actually go more utopian, like this is the more utopian version, and we say this is the big picture, this is how we could change things, decommodify housing. We can do it all, right? I say to people, like, in social housing, you can do it all. You can keep people housed for a very long time. You can have cross-subsidization. You can get everyone housed. You can satisfy almost every space of it. And it's testament to that is that everyone who is interested in the housing policy space generally agree that social housing is the way to go. So you have people who usually are at odds with each other agree on this one space, and it's because it can deliver it all. And getting it all right is why it's important, why we're taking our time with the draft policy. And it's going to take a little bit of time, but we definitely have a lot of legislators who I didn't even originally thought would be interested have approached me about it, and they like the concept and they've heard about it perhaps, but now it's all about working out the details, right? Funding will also be tough. Even though California, we've reached the historic $250 billion in our budget, and it will grow and grow and grow. Certainly, and I have no doubt about that. That will be difficult, certainly, but I do think there's a lot of mechanics that we can play around with. We are blessed to have a very vibrant economy and also a lot of options to do things, but historically a lot of aversion to tax policy or funding things. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a war chest at our disposal. Another thing I would say about the education's piece and the resources is 5 years ago, roughly, Californians in general and California politicians thought the housing issues were a San Francisco problem. I can tell you, as being an hour away from San Francisco, it is not a San Francisco problem. And in San Jose, where I live, it is the second most expensive place in the country to rent now. It is an expanding problem. And I always tell this to my Republican colleagues is you can do two things. You're at a crossroads right now. You can do nothing about the housing crisis, and you can Californianize all the red states. In which case, I don't think you like that either. Or you can solve the housing crisis now and make sure that places where people want to live, especially metropolitan areas, have the abundant housing for people to live. So you can solve, it's either issue, right? Either or. But we gotta educate people about that, right? Because in the last 5 years, as people have finally realized and woken up that the housing crisis is a problem, unfortunately, they've kind of gravitated only towards market-based solutions. And while I believe there is a role for this, there is a role for market-based solutions in the current environment we have. People put too many eggs in it, right? We can't just say everything will happen if we let developers do whatever they want. Certainly things will happen if we let them do whatever they want. Certainly things will happen. I cannot argue with that. But will it be the changes we want to see, right? And there's that kind of tension where a lot of, I think, policymakers are invested in market-based solutions. And when we give them this alternative, they are very curious. They're very piqued. and it's about educating them right in the right direction. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in California.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Assemblymember Lee. We are a few minutes over. I didn't get a chance to get Saoirse back in here, but I just want to plug the paper that Saoirse wrote for the People's Policy Project in 2018 is incredible. That's how I found her and brought her into the Homes Guarantee campaign. We dropped the Homes Guarantee briefing book in the chat. Check that out. If you're interested in municipal social housing, check out the Casey Tenants Housing Trust Fund proposal. And obviously follow Delegate Stewart and Assemblymember Lee on Twitter and all other socials for more information on their path to winning social housing in Maryland and California. The final thing I want to say is exactly what all of these panelists have said. This is not a radical idea. As the tenants in my base across the country and in Kansas City say all the time, this is what the people are owed, right? This is not radical. It's not new. Google Vienna social housing. Those buildings are gorgeous. Architects fight over those contracts. People love to live there. It's a 100-year experiment that has, by all accounts, been successful, right? So let's bring this to America. Let's start at the state house level, maybe in Maryland and California. Let's win it at the municipal level in places like Kansas City. Thank you all so much for your time. It's been inspiring to be with you.